Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Georgia Tech Library, and welcome to the Scholars Event Theater here in the Georgia Tech Library. My name is Kirk Henderson. I'm the Exhibits Program Manager here at the Georgia Tech Library. We're here tonight for a panel discussion based on our most recent exhibit, Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill, New South Industry. The exhibit is located adjacent to this space in the exhibit gallery just behind you. I hope you've all had a chance maybe to look through there or to take that opportunity after we finish our program here tonight. The exhibit explores the history of the mill and, in brief, the relationship between this New South industry and what was then called the Georgia School of Technology. It showcases documents, photographs, artifacts, and architectural records. All of these are from our Fulton Mill collection. And yet, the exhibit itself reveals only a small portion of this extensive collection of materials. And all of these things are available to the Georgia Tech faculty, to students, and to the general public for research. So tonight's panel is entitled Unraveling History, the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill from Past to Present. We'll explore the topics introduced by the exhibit, and we'll hope to shed a light on the mill's significance, its symbiotic relationship to Georgia Tech, and its value as a unique contemporary educational resource. Today's panel discussion, just a word on how it's formatted. We've asked each of our presenters to prepare a short set of visual slides, and each panelist will have 5 minutes to tell their portion of the story. And after we finish that part, I'll have a few follow-up questions for each panelist. And all of that will take roughly 30 minutes here in the first part of our program. And then at that point, we'll open up the floor to questions from you all and take questions for about 15, 20 minutes at the end there. So just to introduce you to everybody who is here or joining us remotely today. So we're joined by Nina Elsas, which is on your far right. Jody Thompson, here just adjacent to me, and also Danielle Willkens. So Nina joins us from the Patchworks Art and History Center in Cabbagetown, where she's been active in historic preservation in the community around the mill. Her recently completed thesis is entitled The Rehabilitation of Fulton Bag and Cotton Mills, a case for a unique public history site and open-air museum. Jody Thompson serves as the head of archives and special collections here at the Georgia Tech Library. She participated in the processing of the Fulton Bag collection to make it available for research. And she also served as one of the curatorial leads on this particular project, this exhibit project. Danielle Willkens, who is joining us remotely, so you should all be able to see her on the screen above me. She is an associate professor in the School of Architecture. She's interested in engaging diverse audiences with architecture through interactive projects. Her class, Race, Space, and Architecture in the United States, used the Fulton Mill Complex as one of its case studies this past spring, and a portion of her students' work was incorporated into our exhibit. So with that, I'm going to turn to our first presenter, and it's going to be Nina. So feel free to take it away.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for allowing me to talk to everybody tonight about Fulton Bag and Cotton Mills. All righty, I'm just going to jump right in. After the Civil War, Atlanta rebuilt, providing job opportunities to immigrants and others moving into the city. In 1861, 18-year-old Jacob Elsas moves from the Kingdom of Württemberg to Cincinnati, then to Nashville, and finally in 1865 to Cartersville, Georgia, where he opens a general store with his first business partner, a former slave named Mose Waite. While running the general store, Jacob realizes that there is a need for bags to carry and/or transport in items in bulk. He also realizes that Atlanta has a better infrastructure for a bag-making industry, so he moves here in 1867. In 1868, Jacob partners with 3 other German-speaking immigrants and forms Elsas, May and Company. The company is very successful in producing both cotton and paper bags. In the 1870s, however, Henry Grady's vision for the New South motivates Jacob to pursue a cotton mill of his own. In 1876, Jacob purchases a charter from H.I. Kimball named Fulton Cotton Spinning Company, restructures his businesses, and in 1881 builds a cotton mill on the site of the Atlanta rolling mill ruins. Jacob's Fulton Cotton Spinning Company is just the second cotton mill established in Atlanta, the first being Kimball's Atlanta Cotton Factory, which eventually failed. With Fulton Cotton Spinning Company's success, Jacob considers expansion. In 1889, he again restructures his businesses and also his partnerships, changing the name from Fulton Cotton Spinning Company to Fulton Bag and Cotton Mills. Starting in 1896, Fulton Bag and Cotton Mills expands the country and by the early 1900s becomes Atlanta's biggest employer and the third largest bag-making enterprise in the U.S. behind Bemis Brother Bag Company and H&L Chase Bag Company. Next slide, please. In the mid-1950s, although the business is still making money and productive, there is a shift on how people shop. Due to the success and proliferation of grocery stores, people no longer need to buy in bulk. The most significant change is the emergence of the multi-walled paper bag. Because of this stronger paper product, along with grocery stores, frozen TV dinners, fast food and cars, the consumer now has more options to pick and choose their food in whatever quantity and however quickly they need it. Also, when cotton bags were being repurposed for clothing and home goods, the onset of fashion in the 1950s diminishes the need to make goods by hand. In 1956, controlling shares of Fulton Bag and Cotton Mills are bought by new ownership. And in 1958, the last cotton bag is printed, and it's here at Georgia Tech Archives. By the early 1960s, the new owners sell all of the Fulton Bag and Cotton factories outside of Atlanta, along with the company housing. The Atlanta mill is sold again in 1968 and in 1972. And in 1974, a global recession cripples many textile companies around the world. The mill shuts down all of its milling processes for that year, but maintained its finishing operations until 1978. A small terry towel sewing operation continues until 1981 with a staff of approximately 100 workers. In July 1981, the factory closes forever. From 1981 until the mid-1990s, the mill compound lies vacant, its buildings and industrial components deteriorating. Next slide, please. So Atlanta has a poor track record for preserving its historical architecture. It isn't until the 1970s that preservation efforts became more widely embraced by the general public, which takes matters into its own hands for the saving of important structures like the Fox Theater. In the early 1970s, for instance, Inman Park is slated to be demolished to make way for a highway that would connect Atlanta with Stone Mountain. The successful effort to save it became one of the real first tests in preserving an entire historical neighborhood. Comparably, in the mid-1970s, Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill and its Mill Village, which today are both part of Cabbagetown, face uncertain futures. In 1975, a group of preservationists and historians recognized the importance of Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill and the Mill Village, submitting a nomination form to place the community on the National Register for Historic Places. In 1976, the nomination is accepted. These grassroots efforts eventually culminate in the creation of an organization known as the Atlanta Preservation Center, which continues to stay vigilant in protecting Atlanta's historical treasures. In 1989, Cabbagetown becomes Atlanta's first landmark district, whereupon the city developed strict rules and regulations that protect the neighborhood. By this time, however, the closed mill is now owned by Seaboard Railroad, also known as CSX, which has its own agenda for what it wants to do with the derelict factory. In 1994, concern grows in the Cabbagetown community that the railroad will allow the mill to fall in such disrepair that it would be demolished. This negligence is illegal based on the city's landmark district guidelines. Cabbagetown residents form a Save the Mill movement that convinces the city officials to give the railroad an ultimatum, to rehabilitate or sell. Thus, in 1996, Adderhold Properties buys the old factory from Seaboard. From 1996 to 2008, Adderhold Properties converts the mill into a residential community. Next slide, please. There were many firsts for Jacob in regards to his mill. It was the first cotton mill to succeed in Atlanta. It had the largest steam engine in Atlanta and possibly in the South. It had a large research and development team that patented different types of bag closures, new weaving techniques, and bag materials. It was the first mill in the U.S. to standardize cotton bag sizes, and perhaps one of the first mills in the South to keep all operations in-house. So no more outsourcing raw cotton and buying back finished materials at a higher cost. Jacob also integrated early at Fulton Bag and Cotton Mills, initially hiring black workers mostly for menial jobs. In 1897, however, he decided to hire 20-plus black women to work nights in the folding department, which had always been strictly considered a white worker's job. His decision enraged the white women in the folding department, causing a major strike, which ended only after Jacob fired the black women. Jacob refused, however, to fire all black laborers, which was one of the strikers' demands. Instead, he continued to integrate, and by 1914, 20% of the mill's workforce was black, making it the largest employer of black workers in the Atlanta industry. The most famous strike was the 1914-1915 strike, which targeted child labor, low wages, unsafe working conditions, and long hours. By this time, Jacob had stepped down, and his oldest son, Oscar, was president of the company. The strike lasted a year, which was the longest in the U.S. labor history. Ultimately, the unions lost, and Oscar prevailed, and the result that would define labor practices across the South. And Jacob often used his wealth for good, giving back to the Atlanta community. He believed strongly in publicly accessible education and public health care. He was the major benefactor and founding of Georgia Tech, woohoo, and Grady Hospital. He was a founding member of the Hebrew Benevolent Society, now known as the Temple Atlanta, and the Hebrew Orphans Home, which is now the Jewish Educational Loan Fund. He chaired many civic committees, including the Atlanta Water Works. All right. Next slide, please. So according to the National Park Service, a site is considered to have public access when it has, quote, at least some visual public access to the property, end quote. This definition is applied when determining a property's eligibility for a federal income tax deduction for a preservation easement. With that said, while the mill community has already sufficient visibility from the public right-of-way, Adderhold Properties had taken the initial steps for adding educational component to the property by creating a mini museum within the complex and by displaying artifacts and mill machinery in and around the buildings. Adderhold clearly made an effort to try to tell the story of Jacob Elsas and the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mills. Building on Adderhold's intentions, additional steps are currently being taken to improve accessibility to the compound and to provide the general public with a more immersive educational experience. Walking towards the Patchworks Art and History Center allows neighbors, residents, and visitors to come inside the complex and see firsthand these historical objects, hear the mill's stories, and imagine what the factory would have looked and sounded like in its heyday. Finally, a Georgia historical marker has been placed outside the complex by the Georgia Historical Society in conjunction with the Patchworks, giving context to the mill's history and solidifying its role as one of Atlanta's most important public history sites.
Thank you, Nina.
Thank you.
So for the next part of our story, we're going to turn to Jody Thompson.
Thanks, Kirk. So I want to talk about how Georgia Tech acquired the collection and its importance. Ooh. Did I turn it off, or can you all still hear me? Okay, sorry, it got really loud for me. So talk about how we acquired the collection and why it's important to Georgia Tech. But I want to focus a little bit on how we got, or how the connection with Jacob and the mill and Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech, Jacob was an early customer of Georgia Tech. He used some of the ironworks that were produced here. And he also was instrumental in starting the textile program here at Georgia Tech. We have documents from the president at the time, Lyman Hall, going back to 1898, and how instrumental he was in establishing the program. We have the documents also talk about Jacob going up to New England to get machinery for Georgia Tech. So there's this really early connection with Georgia Tech's history and the mill. Okay, next slide. Okay, so let's get back and talk about how we acquired the collection. So unfortunately, we have no photographs from the day Georgia Tech acquired the collection. We do have paperwork. So we have the owners at the time, the Allied Product Corporation. We have the acquisition paperwork, so it told us a lot about what was coming in. We also have Bob McMath's article in Labor Heritage from 1989 that actually goes deep into how he met the mill operators. I think it was actually one of the engineers. And so Bob McMath, as a history professor and another history professor, took their industrial archaeology class to the mill. And they got to see the mill, the interiors, they got to see the machinery, they conducted some oral histories, and they got to see some public records, but unfortunately they didn't get to see the actual documents, the history that was produced by the mill. So unfortunately their students didn't get an opportunity to get hands-on experience with primary sources. So that was in the late 1970s. Now let's jump ahead to 1985. Bob McMath, that professor who got a tour with his students, he gets a phone call from Allied Products Corporation. They want to donate the collection to Georgia Tech. So the collection comes here, and then that means that the archives became the curators of this collection. It was a very small archives at the time. It took several years before it was even processed. And then next slide, please. Okay, so we have the archivist. As I mentioned, it took several years to process it. It has actually been processed several times in different periods of time, just because we wanted to give more access to the collection, and so we found that and with technology, we're able to create finding aids for this collection and make it more accessible. So let's talk about what actually is in the collection and what the archivist encountered back in 1985 when the collection came in. This collection is absolutely massive. It's over 600 linear feet of materials, and 400 of them are made up from the ledgers. And hopefully you saw some of the ledgers, or the one ledger in the exhibit. And so just a high-level description of what came with the collection. So we have extensive correspondence with the mill owners, mill management, and also correspondence between the Elsas family and some civic leaders, and different opportunities to have workings with the other business leaders in Atlanta. The materials date back from the 1800s up to the 1990s. The correspondence I was just speaking about are dating back from the early 20th century up until about the 1940s. We also have extensive strike records. There were three, Nina mentioned several of the strikes, so there were 3 strikes that took place. There is an extensive amount of material on the 1914-15 strike, and so a lot of it, you'll see that in the exhibit. We also have personnel records, and they really stop at about the 1970s, so you get a good opportunity to see some of the actual people who worked in the mill. And then we also have photographs as well, and they are dating back from the 1890s up until the 1950s. We also have an extensive amount of architecture drawings in this collection. They are dating back from the 1880s up into the 1950s, and it really documents the design and the construction of the mill complex. Also, other mills throughout the United States that the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mills actually own, like in New Orleans and in Dallas. And then also we have sorry, just lost my train of thought with that. But one of the pieces I do want to also mention, another connection with Georgia Tech and the mill. Lockwood Green was one of the architects for several of the buildings in the mill complex here in Atlanta. And Georgia Tech's textile building that was constructed for the actual program in the 1890s was also Lockwood Green. So again, more connection between Georgia Tech and the mill. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm talking about all of these materials that were part of this collection, and it's quite extensive, and Kirk was talking about opening it up for people to do research, to general public and to Georgia Tech faculty. And so there's multiple ways that the archivists, their work has impacted the research of others and exhibits. So for instance, hopefully some of you have read Cliff Kuhn's book, Contesting the New South Order. It was about the 1914-15 strike. I highly recommend it because it goes into detail, great detail about the strike. And also people have also had opportunities to write articles. We actually used the collection itself when we were doing our research on the exhibit. And there's also been opportunities for actually people who live in Cabbagetown. They have come to our archives to do research on if they're doing restorations on their homes. And so another opportunity that we have worked with others is actually Danielle. A lot of the classes here, the professors will bring their classes and having an opportunity to actually get hands-on experience. And then Danielle's going to kick it off, I think, with how with her students used our collection.
Thanks, Jody. So now we'll turn to our remote guest, Danielle Willkens. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much, and hello from Austria. I'm currently with the first year semester abroad program, traveling program, so we have a busy schedule, but I'm really glad to be able to join this and be part of this investigation. As mentioned, this was part of a seminar in the spring called Race, Space, and Architecture in the United States. We're very fortunate that we have a lot of guest speakers come in to the class. We talk about a lot of issues within the built environment that are often glossed over or ignored or maybe even erased, especially those questions of sort of labor, race, gender, economic status, things like that. And Atlanta makes for a great classroom in many ways. So what students do during that course is they select a project in teams, kind of give them a menu of options. The class has run for 3 iterations, and each time they take on a different set of projects. And you can see a couple that we've done in the past on the left-hand side, just in the graphic. English Avenue Elementary School, the Atlanta Prison Farm. We had some interfaced work with a component that's often left out of the Selma to Montgomery March, which is all of the organizations that happened in Marion, Alabama. So last spring, we were able to partner with the library, and thankfully through the Atlanta Preservation Center and also Easements Atlanta, we were able to have access to the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill. And Emily, Ryan, Lizzie, and Josh tackled that project. It was an interesting mix of architecture and engineering students. So they were looking at both the kind of physical aspects of the building from a design standpoint, but also in production as they zoomed in to the complex and particularly studied the power plant. And you can head to the next slide. So we're able to use some of the cutting edge technology that we have access to here at Tech, a 3D scanner. So essentially this is a non-invasive type of digital documentation technique. It gets us information down to essentially less than a 1/16 of an inch in terms of the resolution. So it's a really great tool for us to record structures, particularly ones that are complex, like the power plant, and that also might have some structural issues that we want to take a look at in detail, where an analog survey would not really be feasible because of the scale or the positioning, or in this case, there was some other restoration work going on at the same time with the smokestacks. So this is a chance to introduce the students to the technology. We're able to use capture stations, and you can see that the tech on the right-hand side, so that little scanner is about $60,000. So it's a very expensive tripod setup there, but it essentially allows us to stitch those together like a jigsaw puzzle and get a picture of the inside and outside. What we often do for sites is also do aerial photogrammetry with the drone. We stayed away at this point in time. We did the original capture, but it's not integrated in this view just because of the other restoration work that was going on at the time. But what's really exciting about these kind of projects and documentation techniques is that we can always go back to the site and take more captures, get more data. We'll be able to see, is a wall moving, what's happening. I'm really excited to pair with Easements Atlanta to kind of integrate into some of their condition assessments. So you get a sense of what's the resulting point cloud. So that's these hundreds of millions of points that are captured, giving a geospatial position, so an XYZ coordinate. And then they also get photographed. And so that means it assigns an RGB or red, green, blue value to it. So it colorizes those points. So this is not like a surface, it's just this series of points, which ends up being a little bit ephemeral and causes some reflections sometimes, like you'll see on the bottom right. We've purposely left some of the noise in here. You see the reflections that are from the pool in that area. So if you head to the next slide. Documenting the interior of the power plant allowed us to really get a good sense of the structure there. This is obviously a place that is not one casually open to the public for safety reasons. And it was a way for us to get a great documentation of what exactly is in that structure. We just did a terrestrial survey, so a ground-based survey with those 17 stations, and gives us a really nice picture of the interior components and a snapshot of the building at that particular time. And the students were able to make a fly-through that's been incorporated into the exhibit. And so it allows us to take you virtually through that space and get a sense of exactly what it's like. And this is a site that I know from an architecture standpoint, we're really excited to think about what this could potentially be in the future. And admittedly, we, on this study abroad, we're just at a mine in Germany that has been decommissioned and now turned into kind of an art center. And so I was definitely excited to think about how some of those lessons learned might get translated into an adaptive reuse here that may turn it into another community asset and help tell the story of the site overall. Next slide. So in addition to the scans, the students broke down the structure into a series of new drawings. So some axonometrics like this that show the site when we would have seen all of the complex buildings together. And I think it's important to get a view like this one to understand kind of the scale of the operations, the density of content, and then understanding where it is within the Cabbagetown, Reynoldstown area. And so we have this amazing resource. It's literally something that's in our backyard. So I'm eager to see how we might continue to explore this site and continue to help document it and help tell the story visually and allow people to understand it possibly through things like virtual reality or even augmented reality with future tours. Next slide. And I think just the last thing I wanted to show is this, it's a living site, right? It's something that still has a vibrancy to it, and nature's starting to take back over in certain places. But we have this amazing resource, both from the archival content and then the physical aspect of the site that's still left. And so I'm very excited to see how Georgia Tech has kind of put a spotlight back on this structure and how we might think about what its use is going to look like in the 21st century. Overall, I think the students were really eager to also study something that was right here in our backyards and to be able to interface with such a rich history directly tied to the Institute. So thank you. I'm looking forward to kind of questions.
Thank you, Danielle. So for this next part, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to cycle back through each of our presenters and with a brief question and let them speak to that, and then we'll open it to audience questions. So I'll return to you, Nina. Mm-hmm. And this, Danielle's presentation suggests this question to me in many ways, but and I know that your thesis concerned this topic as well. So how is the historical legacy of the mill being preserved in the neighborhood's current context, and what are the challenges of maintaining that sense of history in the midst of what is, potentially a gentrifying area?
Right, good question. Thank you for that. So, architecture and buildings tell stories. And as the Patchworks, we realize that those stories need to be heard, and that it's about the people that worked and lived in and around Cabbagetown or the Mill Village at that time. And so with gentrification, those voices tend to disappear and those stories tend to disappear. And so in order to make it relevant, you have to talk about it and you have to share it with the people and you have to make it accessible. And that includes the residents that live there. So we are in an interesting position where we have this public history site based on the definition that I had stated earlier, that as long as it has accessibility from a public right-of-way, it's considered a public history site. But because it's a gated residential community, that kind of makes it weird, for it to be accessible to the public because of the residents that live there. So one thing that we have been doing as the Patchworks is introducing more didactic text. No one really knows what some of these buildings are, And so with the Georgia Historical Marker that we just received this year, it actually is putting the mill into context. And with that, it's giving people more interest in what was happening in and around this neighborhood. I'm just going to go on a little tangent just for 1 second. We actually had a resident a few years back that had no idea that he was living in a factory, which I thought was pretty amazing when there were smokestacks. But, you know, and then, you know, so we scratch our heads and we say, well, how do we get that information out? So we do walking tours, and those walking tours are for the residents as well. It's for Cabbagetown, it's for people who want to come and visit, it's for students who want to learn more. Because there are a lot of things that had happened on this site that need to be talked about, the race relations, the child labor, the many firsts that I spoke about. And so all of those things are very, very important to just keep going, because again, it'll just disappear if it's not talked about and preserved and conserved for many years to come.
Thank you. Thank you. So next question is for Jody. So why is the mill important to the history of Atlanta? And I think Nina and you have both covered that, and to the South in general. And is there any particular artifact, piece in the collection that sort of suggests that importance to you, or stands out in that way to you?
Well, I think I'm going to focus on really Cabbagetown a little bit, like what Nina talked about. Certainly the architectural collections that we have and the photographs, especially there's, I think one points out in the exhibit, just how the buildings are now becoming more, sorry, I'm just, sorry, you gave me this question and it's.
No, it's like, so the context of the neighborhood is changing. So like in the same way that Nina was talking about this, and also the points that Danielle was making in terms of like, there's this rich historical tapestry that is there, but we find the neighborhood is sort of changing. I think recently we were discussing like what the property values of a house might be in that neighborhood, and how that changes the perception of the area, and what's lost, and how we can preserve those stories.
Yeah, and then let me focus or change a little bit about so that I can actually answer the question, so I apologize to everyone. I think that a little bit about the history, trying to go back to Georgia Tech and the importance of the mill with Georgia Tech, I think we can look back to Jacob Elsas. As I mentioned earlier, he was very much instrumental in establishing the textile program here at Tech. And as I mentioned, we also have some of the documents, but we also, within the correspondence with Jacob that we have in the extensive collection with the 1914-15 strike, I think that we can certainly focus on his establishment of the program here. And if we look back to the 1890s, Georgia Tech with the textile program, we're producing a lot of Georgia men going out and working in the mills, establishing as leadership roles, and we're doing the leadership roles on a local level. They were meeting with civic leaders and really making an impact here locally. And then because of Jacob's work, we can also look at what we are now with the engineering program, or the School of Science and Materials engineering program. It's really moved to a global level, and it's because of some of, I think, Jacob's interest in his work that he's done with the textile program, and I think it just speaks to the documentation that we have here at Georgia Tech.
Right. It's like the papers, the collection itself that we have is also a legacy. Perpetuating sort of like that history, whereas like in what Nina was speaking about, and also Danielle, is like the physical context of the neighborhood and the buildings themselves. So next I'll turn to you, Danielle. So for in your case, how does it to working with students who may be oriented towards engineering and architecture to get them to think about a site, a historical site, in a way that goes beyond simply its structure, but also its social context, historically, or in a contemporary sense as well.
Sure, thanks. Well, I think we're kind of spoiled that we have students that are really just inherently engaged, or at least I think that the seminar attracts students that are interested in those stories and want to go beyond the literal brick and mortar to understand the systems that have built our cities and kind of our history within the United States, both the triumphs, but then also the challenges and some of the systemic issues that we see. I know something that the students were really intrigued by as they were working on this project was the content that they could find for Cabbagetown, and then really the lack of record that was available for Reynoldstown. And what does that say? That's not a coincidence. Even though we're talking about kind of demographics that both found challenges within Cabbagetown and within Reynoldstown. So yeah, I think the course is a little bit self-selecting, that it gets students who are really engaged in those kind of topics. But I think the fact that they do have the literal interaction that's available through the drawings, through the site visits. Again, we're super fortunate to have those kind of partnerships through Atlanta Preservation Center and Easements Atlanta that provides us access. And then the Elsas family, who was phenomenal. Jacob was super generous with his time with the students and provided a lot of information. So I think that was something that we were really fortunate to have. And I think that speaks a lot to the kind of curiosities that we have within our students, and the fact that they're eager to kind of get outside of the collegiate bubble and know a little bit more about their place and have their work actually cause an impact, right? That it's not just simply an academic exercise, but it's something that might help open up a new vein of investigation, might actually help with some economic regeneration, help really with the story of this place, and that it's a rare survival. We look at mill towns in the South, and unfortunately, there's only a handful that are still around. Even in like the last decade, if you look at things that were along the Chattahoochee that were systematically just demolished, we saw a huge amount in the last 10 years or so. Less than 60 miles away, right? I think I can think of 4 mills off the top of my head that were demolished, that could have easily been transformed into other sites. So thinking about how this one remains in place and remains a way to tell Atlanta's story and Georgia Tech's story, I think is really exciting.
Thank you. So now, having got to ask my questions, I'm going to invite all of you to ask some questions. We have someone who's going to help bring a microphone to you if you have a question. This is so that when we record this, we can all hear your question. So please feel free to quiz us.
Hey, good evening. I'm having my own blank spot here. So I have a copy of Dr. M.L. Britton's 1948 story of Georgia Tech, which tells a lot of great information about the origin of the school in the early years. This story is underrepresented in that book. Any idea what might have caused that or why that is?
I'll venture a little bit of an answer to that. I think that when we began this project, we, of course, had captured the collection several years ago, and because of staffing issues with our small archives at the time when this was collected in the early or in the mid-1980s, it didn't really get processed. And so when we came to making this exhibit, we had the benefit of the archivist having gone through it and processed the collection. And so we set out to at least tell as much as the story as we could in a small exhibit area. And we kind of ventured the mill is over there in Cabbagetown, and Georgia Tech is here. there's textile engineering here. There's kind of some connection there. But what happened is the further we got into it, we actually found some of the documentation that established that relationship more clearly. And this is documentation that I think probably might not have been on M.L. Britton's desk when he was writing the story of Georgia Tech in that case. And so that's one respect in which it may have been lost from that kind of a work. I think it's certainly more evident if you look at a more recent work. Jody mentioned Bob McMath as a historian of Georgia Tech and who was instrumental in getting the collection here. So there's a book called Engineering the New South, which was done in 1985 for the centennial of Georgia Tech. And I think there's a good bit more information about that relationship between Georgia Tech and Georgia industry at the time. If not specifically mentioning the Elsas family or the Fulton bag mill, but some of the documentation we discovered in researching this exhibit sort of really makes that connection very clear in terms of Jacob being a lobbyist for establishing a school like Georgia Tech. I think Jacob's son, Oscar, ended up going to MIT before he came back to graduate from Georgia Tech. So he was, the father, Jacob, was interested in we need a school here in the South that fulfills the role that MIT was in.
Yeah, the bib company in Macon got some credit in Dr. Britton's book, but not Fulton Bag for some reason. Yeah.
And just to go off what Kirk was saying about not having some access to the documents, I think that just speaks volumes as to the importance of archives and making sure that we're preserving these materials so that they can be used and tell the true story.
Thank you for your question. We have one at the back here.
Dr. Willkens, how you doing? The big thing also to think about this is also, too, when you take Reynoldstown and you take Cabbagetown, one of the big things, when Cabbagetown lost its school, that was a great instigator for doing it, is really promoting historic preservation. And one of the great things you talk about, and so often this, is if you don't like to live in Cabbagetown, try Reynoldstown. It's kind of one of those things, like historic preservation is really instrumental in this. But I do think a big thing about this is really talking about what Nina has done in a lot of ways, what Danielle has done in a certain way too, is also incorporate the student in a way that's really unparalleled. And I think it's a big thing people need to start realizing more and more. Everyone in this room is great, it's super, but if the students aren't involved and the younger generations are coming up and interested in this, they're not gonna, the stories really become irrelevant. They simply become archives that people don't use. And that engagement is huge. And so when you take, for example, when Danielle, one thing she didn't mention in the big scan of the boiler room, if you will, with the number of dead rats, the kids had to see that kind of stuff. They had to actually engage a space that they don't normally accustom themselves to. Like you had to get out of your safety. And I think that's a really big and important thing to do with this. And when you get into these kind of things also, when you get into the mill culture and the mill structure, there's a big thing too. That West Georgia did a whole big thing, the mill trail, and coming back through and seeing this, but also take consideration the fact that Atlanta in the post-war, you have Oakland Cemetery, you have a mill next door to it. All of a sudden everybody says, we're not gonna do this, they go to Westview. You start to see this kind of incorporation and change and alteration, how the urban environment really folded. And so in a certain way, what you're really doing is kind of laying bare poor planning this city has had since inception in the post-war. And I think there's a lot of that to be said. And also too, where were Jewish people able to start business? Where were people around the city able to do these things? So this archive is a more important thing. I mean, obviously I'm an advocate for the archives. You owe me an email. So the thing about it is that, the big thing about it is like, this is the big thing. You have to contribute. The last thing too is for those of you that have stuff, contribute it. This is an archive, this is a repository. Don't die with your stuff. Really, that's a big important.
Thank you. The question here at the front.
A little feedback. Is that me? I think that's me. Me? Yeah. Okay. Hey.
I had a question for Jody. Microphone. Yeah. I think you mentioned, Jody, that Lockwood Green designed some of the mill structures. Mm-hmm. I had some dealings with them before they were bought out by CH2M Hill back in 2003. I was interested in their work for the government during the First World War, and was concerned about their archives. It turns out that, you probably know this, but that the CH2M Hill is a think, a German engineering firm, and they had the good sense to take all the Lockwood Green drawings, engineering drawings, and donate them to the Smithsonian with a cash donation for the preservation and cataloging. So that's where they are now, if you didn't know that.
And I believe University of South Carolina may have some as well.
Oh, is that right? Their headquarters down was when I visited them, they were in Spartanburg. They moved from New York to Spartanburg years ago, and that's where I was there. And I was concerned that all that stuff would go out in the trash, but it was saved.
And so again, I think just how so important to make sure that we're preserving these materials so that they can be used for the future in so many different ways.
Bill drawings being burned, and that engineering firm had the good sense to realize their value. So did you get any of those drawings copies of them by this chance?
No, unfortunately we didn't. All we have is what I'd mentioned here on campus, and then some of them that are part of Fulton Bagged.
So what I was interested in were quartermaster drawings of barracks buildings from the First World War, and I had a researcher up there photograph what I wanted in the Smithsonian's collection.
So that's great that you were able to get some photographs.
Expensive, but they're available. It's interesting, though. In the mill buildings, another question. Back in that era, the power transfer was generally through line shafts. Out of steam plants, we'd have slide valve engines or some kind of steam engine running these line shafts, and they would power belts. The machinery was generally belt driven. In my experiences, was that the case at Fulton Mill? Do you know?
That would be a question for Nina.
I honestly don't know. When you walk into the boiler house and the power plants, you can't tell what the machines are at this point. You don't really know, what is what, because it's deterioration and just lack of anything, really. It's just pipes and just parts.
Follow-on question, I was interested in what of the plant's machinery is still there?
Yes, there is machinery there. Yeah.
Looms and so forth, are they still in place?
Yeah, Jake, do you want to answer that? I can see my husband behind you. Like, go ahead. What is exactly in there? I'll defer to you for 1 second.
Well.
Danielle, can you hear anything happening? Yeah.
Back to Alex.
Yeah.
Next.
So you can explain that a little bit better than me. So I will defer that to you, husband Jacob.
Well, first you were asking about kind of like pulley systems and whether that was the way machinery is operated. Is that correct? As far as yeah.
Commonly, they have line shafts.
Yes.
And they would run belts.
Early on, that was absolutely, and in fact, there are photos in Georgia Tech archives that show those systems in place. None of that exists now, which is what Nina was saying. So the evidence is gone. That being said, by the early 1920s, one of Jacob's big dreams, visions, or whatever you want to call it, that came to fruition was to create an electrical grid of his own. So eventually the power plant expanded upwards to about 1925. They kept building on it. So it did eventually produce its own power, electrical power, that then took over a lot of the operations that the pulleys had once done. In fact, the power plant was so successful that they didn't need power off of Atlanta's power grid. They had their own power.
So at this point, we have another question at the back.
Thank you.
Let's move
Sorry,
on
I
to.
didn't mean to put you on the spot. Sorry.
Hi, so I will just say archives do get used. Just going to correct that. We like to have people in the archives. I am curious about the relationship between Georgia Tech archives and Patchworks these days. And I was hoping that both Nina and Jody could maybe speak to that.
And with our connection?
Yeah.
Okay, sure. We're actually going to talk about this at another time in the future, but we'll talk about it now as well. So when Jacob and I started the Patchworks In 2014, 2015, we just kind of did a test run, if you will, to see if a museum would be viable in Cabbagetown. And we knew that there was a connection with Georgia Tech based on the family archives that we already had. And so in doing research on how to archive materials and collections management and things of that nature, we took a trip here to Georgia Tech and we met Jody, who was very, very instrumental in showing us how to start doing our collections management and taking care of what we had already from, again, the family archives. And so since then, it just has developed into a wonderful friendship. And she has been instrumental going forward in how we were building our collections and the documents that we needed and just overall museum management materials that we needed since we were just learning how to do this. And so, you know, it's just, she was just really fantastic in allowing us to see what they were doing so we wouldn't have to recreate the wheel and allowing us to use some of their information.
And then also with the Patchworks and several of their first and second location, we loaned them some, like the sewing machine, and so just to give an opportunity to showcase what they didn't have, and then I know that y'all have been getting more materials.
Yes.
And so I think that there will always be this connection between Georgia Tech and the Patchworks.
So I think we have time for one more question. At the back there.
Hey, Danielle, this question is for you. What did your students think about using technology was that a Matterport that you used?
So that's a 3D scanner.
Okay.
So yeah, so a little Matterport is kind of LiDAR light, but we have one of those that we use for different things. But we use the kind of higher grade kind of survey level 3D scanner to use the content. And I would say that's also one of the things that maybe attracts students to the class is that technology it has special software that we have to use. There's obviously a kind of a setup procedure to it. It's not something that just gets casually loaned out. So within a smaller seminar, it ends up being an attractive way to work with students for some dedicated sites, and they physically get to kind of work with the content, work with drone documentation. So I'd say it's the class selfishly is very much where my interests are, that is all the way from the archives to the super kind of tech geek realm, and everything in between of like, how do we pull these different types of medias and documentations together?
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank everyone here who has joined us today. I especially want to thank all of our panelists, Nina, Jody, and Danielle, for bringing their expertise to us here at the Georgia Tech Library. Feel free to browse in the exhibit after we adjourn here. And I think all of us, with the exception of Danielle, unfortunately, who was joining us remotely, will be here to answer any further questions you all might have. So thank.
Since you're recording this, will the recording be made available any place?
Yes, it will.
Will you repeat that question?
Oh, so repeating the question. The question was, will a recording of this panel discussion be made available? And yes, that is the case. Typically what happens is the library maintains a digital repository, and one of the things we capture in that digital repository are these kinds of programs. So thank you all very much.